I'm so sorry I can't speak in Lithuanian. I should be able to, the amount of time I came here, but thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure coming and interacting, and an honor to come and interact in Vilnius. And I first started coming here in 2008 when the Bokšto project started, and it was a 14-year journey. But what was really interesting was to see how the country evolved, and how the society evolved, and how the buildings evolved, and how the mentalities evolved, and also the construction industry, the way it sort of matured through the process. And so it was an incredibly interesting journey for both, I think, the client, definitely, for us, and for the local architect. I think Sigita is... Hello, hi. She should be up here as well. We were sort of working throughout the process from the very beginning. This lecture is about redoing buildings, and I'm going to take you through two projects because I thought maybe you've seen a lot of Lithuanian projects, and maybe I just take you to the Alps in Switzerland and just show you a little bit how we approach projects in general, and whether it's a new build or whether it's a refurb. But the first thing that we always say is we're contextualists. So we work in many places. We work in a lot of countries and a lot of cultures. And what is really important to us is that we are contextualists. And so we don't come with a foreign attitude, or we try to really understand what the story of the place is, and what the culture of the place is. And how do we do that? We partner up with local firms, and we listen very hard to what they have to say. We research a lot, and in fact I tend to also hire architects in-house. So when we were doing Bokšto, we had Lithuanian architects who essentially helped me navigate the cultural aspect of the project. And when we look at projects, there's always, I mean, I keep coming back to this is Vitruvius, Roman architect, but the three pillars of architecture, firmitas, utilitas, menustas, structural stability, we all know that, commodity, utility, fit for purpose, we all know that. These are things that we always sort of talk about, but this is the questionable one, the one that is probably the most subjective or the most difficult to grasp. These are pretty straightforward, but this is very difficult to grasp, and it's always, how do you create the light in a project? How do you bring the light to a project, and how do you find its new meaning? And when you're talking about taking over a space or refurbishing or repurposing, there are so many aspects that come into play. And it's not just the author, not just the architect, but there's all these other aspects of light, reflection, sound, history, culture, contextualism. And I really like, D.H. Lawrence once wrote about writing a book, and I think there's quite a similarity in terms of doing a architectural project, is that he said sometimes you've got to trust the story, not just the author, meaning where does this project take you, where does this story take you? And this is where some of the things that feed into the project are beyond our own, what we bring to the project. Some of the subjects that we deal with, and these are sort of more personal subjects, and we try to look at them as ideas that kind of not repeat themselves, but find themselves in our project. And we often talk about light as a building material. And this is what I once wrote. I was saying that light is to architecture like pulse is to music. It's the witness of time. It's a metaphor of life. The artistic life of the building is expressed through the way it produces and modulates its light. So we kind of tend to think of light and how light sort of manifests itself in buildings. And also how we play with light in terms of manipulating form and manipulating structure and making things appear as if they are dematerialized. And then reflection is another building material we use. And Bokšto, you'll see, is very much a testament to this idea. But essentially, how do we play with reflection? And there is no truth, there's only perception. the sense of what it does to buildings and how it sort of makes us think of, makes us perceive spaces and makes spaces disappear or appear. And then the third one, which you'll see in the first project I'm showing you, is sound and how acoustics and the perception of space through acoustics is also something that we think about, and that probably is the most ephemeral one, but it's actually a very interesting one, and that just came from the work that we do in concert halls. We do quite a bit of work on concert halls, and so acoustics is obviously something that interests us, but acoustics is essentially physics, and it deals with volumetrics, and it affects your brain, and it affects the way you perceive space. And so there's something quite interesting about that. And if you look at historically how Romanesque churches, or just churches in general, evolved, there was a tie with the way music evolved. And so it's a bit the chicken and the egg, which one influenced the other, or probably they both influenced each other. But this idea of acoustics and building were very much tied together, and very much a manifestation of the architecture. And you can see how music evolved, and this is the Baroque period where music was sort of delicate Mozart, very colourful, and how the architecture similarly sort of responded to that. And that was when the patrons were princes who were doing chamber orchestras, and so there was a much more intimate kind of setting. And then you move to the classical style, and this idea of the concert hall, the shoebox concert hall, being discovered as the perfect acoustic volume, and how as instruments started growing and orchestras started growing, the architecture of the concert hall also started growing, and this all had to do with acoustics. And at the time they didn't have the tools that we have in terms of understanding acoustics, but they had the intuition, and kind of through understood that the Musikverein in Vienna, for example, is considered one of the best acoustic spaces, and it very much has to do with the volumes. And then Scharoun came along in the Philharmonie in Berlin and completely disrupted everything and created the vineyard style, and that again acoustically was very much an intuitive process, but very successful, and also considered a fantastic space. So new art is formed without the limits of boundaries, meaning that you always have, in every architectural project, you have boundaries, you have sets, things that sort of hold you back, and then how do you work around them, or how do you work with them, and then how do you create something new? So this is I'll just show you two projects, the Andermatt Concert Hall, and then I'll show you Boxster as the grand finale. But the Andermatt Concert Hall was an interesting project because we were given this hall. It was one developer who was developing a resort in the Alps in Switzerland. The army had left that place, and basically the village was left with not much, and so an Egyptian developer came along and decided to redevelop it and redevelop the ski slopes, etc. And what he did essentially was to create first a large hotel, and then create a whole area, a whole new village along this plain here for residential and hotel accommodations. And he asked us to do one. He was building a hotel. And then asked us to do a concert hall in what was essentially the conference room of the hotel. And the ambition was to have the Berlin Philharmonic come with a 120-piece orchestra, etc., etc. But essentially we were given this very small volume below ground with no natural light, with very reduced ceiling heights. And essentially, when we got this project, I first thought, well, this is kind of ridiculous, and maybe we shouldn't do this project because it's going to fail. And so we said to the client, well, you've got 6.3 meter ceiling heights. Acoustically, it's not going to work. You need much higher ceilings. Volumetrically, it's just not going to work. This is just for chamber orchestra. Or a conference room, but this is not a concert hall. And he was being quite stubborn, so he said, no, absolutely. So then we went to Berlin to the opening of the Divan Orchestra, this small hall done by Frank Gehry, and which had exactly the same floor plan as ours, but had this 13.5 meter ceiling height. And I took the client there, and we kind of sat in different seats, and I sort of made him realize what sound does in the volumetrics, and made him understand that actually we needed more volume in order to make it work. We were given the project, and we literally had 12 months to finish it. So we weren't allowed to go back to planning. We had to use the same foundations. All of these different, we couldn't, there was this thing called the QGP line, which we couldn't move around. And so there was very limited as to what we could do. And essentially, what we propose is to cut the roof of the building and raise the roof of the building, and then add what we call the backpack, hang a backpack at the back of the building, so that we wouldn't have to have new foundations because we couldn't, and then create this large piece of glass overlooking the Alps. It was the first hall that was built in the Alps, and to us it was this idea, that this conceptualist idea, that you want to feel that you are in the elements, that you can see the Alps, that you can see the cows on the mountains, you can see the skiers coming down. When there's a snowstorm, you see it, you're part of it. And so we wanted to create this space that essentially the walkers by, the pedestrians here, could just look into the concert hall. The audience could look out onto the mountains, but essentially also creating a much larger volume, both actually in terms of volumetrics, but also perceptively. The minute you put a piece of glass here, your volume starts looking much bigger. And this was the very first sketch that we did, where we said that the acoustic reflectors could become pieces of art on this pedestrian street. And we moved the stage to the other end. We kind of centrally located it and put all the audience around it. And then, because the volume was still not big enough, we discovered this this electroacoustic system that basically takes the sound and throws it back at us milliseconds afterwards. And what this does essentially is it gives the impression that the space is bigger than it actually is. And so when you are in the space, the conductor can play with the reverberation and start, the minute you have a bigger orchestra, it can start feeling that it's in a much bigger volumetric space, and then therefore the acoustics become more important, more enveloping, and more perceptively more interesting. But what is amazing is when you turn on the system, suddenly visually the space appears bigger. And this is where this neuroscience trick happens, is that you realize that you actually see with your ears and your eyes. When you're in a cupboard and you make a sound, you can perceive from your ears, or when you're in a cathedral, you perceive with your ears the size of the volume. So essentially this idea that visually as well as acoustically, if you start manipulating your space, then the acoustics will change dramatically, or the way you perceive the music will change dramatically. And this is the space before, and this is after we raised the roof and created a backpack. And you can see here the different configurations. From the street, it looks like a very small, modest little pavilion, and then below ground it becomes a larger concert hall. And you can see here, these were the early sketches. We created this origami architecture because some of these panels had to be, all of this is about reflection and sound reflection and creating the right enveloping sound throughout. But some of these panels had to be acoustically transparent, some of them had to be reflective, and so we created this language where everything is hidden and it sort of appears like this origami sculpture, and these three acoustic reflectors that can come up and down depending on the performances. And all the technical aspects of the projects are hidden. There's about 187 speakers and microphones for this microacoustic system, and essentially all of this is hidden within the architecture. And this being the important part, where you sit in this auditorium and you can see literally the cows in the summer, or this is a ski slope in the winter. And then as we've been sitting in concerts and children would walk by and put their nose on the glass. And here's some of the views. These are the acoustic tests that we were doing earlier on, because you all are like tuning an instrument. A concert hall is basically a large instrument for the orchestra. And this is the opening night with the Berlin Philharmonic. Anyway, so that was Voxto, manipulation through acoustics. And essentially the thing that is similar, every project has its story, and what we do as architects is find the story. What story are we trying to tell? And and what is it that we're trying to do to cities with our interaction. And it's quite a responsibility, but also when you're looking at historical structures, essentially there is intervention that you are doing with the structures, and you're kind of trying to think, what is it that they want to become? What were they built for? What will they become? And how will they evolve through time? And that was something that was particularly important for this project. Now, we started the project in 2008. And before Sigita came on board, we had another local architect. And whatever we showed, he basically said it can't be done because of planning. So I hired a young architect out of a bar in Dublin who was Lithuanian, and I asked him to translate all the planning. And what we realized is that actually it was very, they were very new, right? I mean, the planning regulations were, here we are 2008, everything is still quite young if we compare to the UK. And there was this search for what does Vilnius want to be? It sort of felt to us. And so we started thinking of, well, how do we deal with these planning regulations, and how do we think about it, and how do we approach them intelligently? So I'll take you a little bit through the journey, but this is the project as we found it. When we started, none of this was renovated. This is a completely different landscape now than it was when we found it. But what we found is that this quarter here was being renovated, and Užupis was also being renovated, but this band in between was not being renovated, wasn't going through the kind of investment that the other two places were. And so while we were trying to figure out what this complex wanted to be, we started as a hotel. That didn't really work. EU funding didn't come through. The airport went bankrupt. I mean, it was sort of financially, it didn't make sense. So as we were trying to figure out what it wanted to be, we kind of realized that we wanted people to be drawn and to have this as a magnet for not only people but also investment. And so this idea of a mixed-use scheme of both a spa, restaurant, offices, residential, parking, all of that made sense, that it was sort of smaller units of many different types that sort of allowed a replication of the city at large rather than one big block for one user type. And you can see here 2008 when we inherited the site, and 2022. But what was very apparent with the site was that both the landscaping and the buildings as complex were just as important. And that was one of the things that we took as a strong concept. The site was a mess when we inherited it. Some of the, this was the most important building here, the Cardinal's Palace with a Soviet tin roof put on top and essentially collapsing through neglect since it was abandoned in 91, and essentially really trying to understand what is it that we should retain and what is it that we should do new, and if we do go and do something new, how do we do it and how do we think about it? And so we went about through a careful recognition of what was added later through Soviet times and what was the original Baroque and classical periods, and really how do we think about it all. And so a lot of excavation went on site, and obviously we found ancient cemeteries on there, and so that whole process took quite a while. But the only, the most important information that we received and were these drawings of the original architecture. And we come as foreigners, we are naive, we don't understand the story or the culture of this, so we come with very fresh eyes. And what amazed me about the Baroque, Lithuanian Baroque, coming from Vienna where my family is that there was this beauty and simplicity between the block and the roof, and there was something quite spectacular about the composition of it all. And that was really what needed to be retained or needed to be protected. And what we wanted to do was essentially avoid some of the later additions of veluxes and roof. But this here was really, to me, kind of blew me away in terms of its minimalism and simplicity. And that's what we wanted to get back, the essence of this Lithuanian Baroque that was so important. So we went through the chromatography, we identified every wall. Sigita helped me understand all of this, and we went through the different periods of Baroque, Classicism and Historicism to talk to the planners about what made sense in terms of demolition and new build. And we use these tools in order to really understand what were the important historical assets on site that should be retained and restored to their original building form, and what are the later additions that detract from the original form as a rationale for demolition. And as we went through this period, it sort of, you can see this overlaying of architecture, which you see prevalently throughout Vilnius, this sort of overlaying of different periods, classical period, Gothic periods, and then contemporary additions. And initially we were told that we couldn't do any contemporary additions and that the roofs had to be clay and, you know, things that we didn't want to do. And so we went back to UNESCO and we asked UNESCO what they thought, and because we were in a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And so this idea that contemporary architecture and preservation of the historic urban landscape should avoid all forms of pseudo-historical design, as they constitute a denial of both the historical and the contemporary alike. And that was really the part that helped us convince the planners that what we were doing was right, that we were celebrating the past, we were celebrating the historical architecture, but we weren't going to imitate it, we weren't going to pretend that the new parts are old. We were going to be very honest about what is old and gets restored, and what is new gets undeniably built as new. So one historical view should not supplant the others, as history must remain readable, while continuity of culture through quality intervention is the ultimate goal. So that was really what helped us convince them. And so we started saying, well, we need to do some new build, because in order to make these buildings work, we needed to add some elements. And we started talking about insertions rather than extensions. And these insertions will link building components or make the historical buildings fit for purpose by adding stairs and elevators, etc. And then we also looked at other historical precedents, and funny enough, I was there last week. But this idea of a building and its landscape working very much in tandem with each other, and this idea of the reflection creating this illusion of oneness between one and the other. And so we started looking at these insertions as buildings that could, you know, exist in between landscape and building. They are neither part of the building, neither part of the landscape. They are part of both of them, and a kind of a tie to them. And this idea of reflection became very important. So, for example, we had to add a lift and a staircase in the Cardinal's Palace. We didn't want to do it on the inside because of the beautiful Gothic vaults, and therefore we added a structure on the outside. And how do we do that without trying to imitate the old and essentially do what the Soviet extension had done and kind of detract from the original? And then we needed an outdoor space for the spa, and so we created this structure here. And then we wanted to bring natural light into the Gothic vaults, so we dug and then created this structure here, which became a restaurant. And then essentially, in terms of the layouts of the main Cardinal's Palace, we have a church that can have all sorts of events. And we have offices, and we have a spa. And as we were trying to figure out how to lay these out, there were essentially three main elements. One is to restore the building to its original form. Two is to find a language for the windows that were both tying back to the historical windows, but yet unashamedly contemporary, so steel windows with a certain detailing. And then this idea of creating a lift and a staircase in front of the building, so we aligned it to the clock tower and essentially created this volume that reflects and is in between landscape and building. And thirdly, then the roof. And the roof was probably the most complex part of the argument, especially with the planners, and the one that took us the most time. And you can see here some of the construction of this lift tower. This is with the client, and how now this lift tower essentially lives in between the building reflects, the historical building reflects the landscape, and essentially plays between the two. And so rather than imitating the historical building, we paid homage to it. And we essentially allowed it to become the prominence and the one that we reflect and play on. And some of you can see how the building kind of disappears and is present, and how it plays with the natural elements, and how it really plays with the historical elements too. On the other side, the restaurant, so we essentially dug in front of the restaurant to bring natural light. It's always this question of what do you do with all these wonderful Gothic basements that you have in Lithuania, and usually they're quite dark, and you go down a little staircase and then you're in the dark. And we wanted to bring natural light, so we essentially dug in front of it, created this dining hall, and allowed natural light to flow into the space and create a restaurant. And these were the early drawings of coming down and having a restaurant with a reflective roof. And you can see here the early some of the early renderings of it, and here the construction of it, and essentially the reflection. And what's wonderful is with this roof and the tree was slightly stressed during construction, but will grow again. But the way the clouds and the tree move on that roof is quite spectacular. Finally, the roof was probably the most difficult element to deal with, and took us the longest to convince the planners, because they understood what we were trying to do in terms of the insertions rather than the additions. But the roof, they kept saying, was quite radical, what we were trying to do. And we made the argument that actually, if you look at Vilnius and this Baroque, or this massing of, a simple mass and a large roof, what happened is that once the Velux was invented, they started populating all these roofs and started taking away from the composition of the original Baroque. And we wanted to sort of stay away from that and saying, look, these Veluxes are no longer radical, but they were radical. And in fact, in our view, they are disruptive. And one of the planning regulations was that all buildings in the old town had to be made of clay. And we wanted to recreate this important image of having a solid roof and a solid base and a simple architecture rather than something that was dotted with many elements. And so these were our drawings. This is the aim of what we wanted to do. And we showed the planners that if you occupy the roofs and you start getting Veluxes in, you've killed your Baroque, and you've killed the essence of what how these buildings were designed. And essentially by putting the glass behind a trellis of metal and not allowing the sky to reflect on the glass, but essentially putting the glass in the shadow and allowing it to disappear behind this fine aluminium lattice in front of it, we were reinstating the simplicity of the Baroque. And so the way we did it essentially is to create an enclosure, a waterproof enclosure of either glass or insulated roof, and then a truss and then a lattice, an aluminium lattice above it that created this solidity, this apparent solidity of the roof, while allowing glazing to be underneath it. And these are operable. And essentially, once we were showing this to the planners, they said, well, it's quite radical, and we don't know that we want to accept metal roofs in the old town, but if you do a mock-up and we'll look at it, we'll accept it. And the client, were very grateful for that, but accepted to make a mock-up and take the risk and go through all the process. And once they saw the mock-up and, the solidity and the simplicity of it, and the effect that it had both from the outside and the inside, they accepted it as a solution for the roofs. And you can see here the effect of the roof from the inside. It's all very brightly lit. You get a sense of the view and some of the plays, as you can see here from the offices on top of, so quite brightly lit, quite pleasant spaces, and yet from the outside, not apparent as Veluxes. This is the spa. The spa was a final big element. The excavation, there was essentially enormous excavations for the parking, the multi-story car park and the swimming pool, and how do we integrate this Gothic maze and the complexity of the geometry of this and create a contemporary spa within this and sort of really pay homage to the historical fabric and yet create something that is contemporary and new. And so we started playing with the idea of terrazzo and the language of terrazzo throughout, and retaining the forms of the Gothic vaults underneath. And so we didn't want to put any lights, we didn't want to disrupt it, we didn't want to put any signage on it. We wanted to keep the pristineness of all of these vaults, and instead of that we came up with this idea of a skirting that would provide the lighting, would provide all of the technical aspects, the ventilation, etc., for the spaces, and allow a sort of comfortable walk through these otherwise quite rough walls along. And this is the spa. This is the new part of the spa as we're moving into the excavated space, and this play of terrazzo, playing with the texture of the terrazzo and different sizes of terrazzo, creating different textures. And you can see here some of the views and the swimming pool. It was the first time we tried a terrazzo swimming pool, so that was quite wonderful. And it was really interesting actually working in Lithuania, and you know, initially when we started in 2008, the suppliers were not there, and we found ourselves having to go abroad to find suppliers, and we didn't like that because we wanted to really build locally. And as the project took so long and progressed, we were able to find wonderful craftspeople who were able to deliver all of this throughout the process. And this is a church, again restored. Whatever is old, we restored it back to its old form, and then whatever is new, we express it as new, including the windows seen from the outside. And you can see here the view. This is one of the views that we showed the planners when we were showing and explaining that the solidity of the roof and the way it appears is important and feels historical. Thank you. I think that's it.